Thank you, everyone, very much for joining today. I think we've got a great discussion ahead of us following the recent release of the ATO R&D report for the year ended 30 June 2022. So, just quickly by way of introduction, my name is Samir Kassam. I'm a co-founder and co-CEO of InCorp Advisory here in Australia. We see ourselves as a go-to firm for growth and emerging companies with those companies that are keenly focused on innovation. So primarily working across areas such as technology, biotechnology, engineering, manufacturing, and a number of other industries. I would like to very quickly introduce our three panelists for today, and we'll quickly run through the agenda in terms of what we're going to go through. The three are Luke Ricks from KC Ventures, Bailey Phillips, who is a manager in our government incentives team at InCorp, and Alex Simmons, who is the co-founder of a business called Kashcade. I might just give the three of you an opportunity to quickly introduce yourselves. Alex, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Amir. So, I'm Alex Simmons, co-founder of Kashcade. We're an Aussie fintech startup, 3 years old, based out of Sydney. Kashcade lets companies bring forward their R&D refunds to today by lending them that money now.
Luke, would you like to go next?
Thanks, Samir. Hi, everyone. My name is Luke Ricks. I'm the co-founder and CEO of KC Ventures. We help startups and growth companies with everything around finance, operations, and strategy. We work with about 40-odd different startups here in Australia, obviously involved very heavily in a CFO, COO capacity and helping them with their R&D returns. In a prior life, I was actually a founder of my own tech company, built and scaled that to 200-odd people. So I have a lot of experience in doing that on the other side of the coin as well. That's what I'll talk about today.
Perfect. Thank you. Over to you, Bailey.
Hey, everyone. So my name's Bailey, and I've been a manager at InCorp for about 6.5 years now. My background is in computers and data science. So my day-to-day is helping companies from pre-R&D claim to getting the documentation in place, to preparing and lodging the claim, to then anything afterwards where we provide further advice in terms of documentation and reviews and things like that.
Perfect. Thanks, Bailey. Thanks, everyone, once again for joining. We've got about 30 people here. I was going to say that if anyone does have, we will leave some time for Q&A at the end. But if you do have questions as we're going along, please use the questions function in the bottom right of your screen to post anything up, and I'll keep an eye on that. And if it's appropriate for us to sort of address it as we go along, then we will do so. What we're going to go through today is we're going to spend a few minutes, or Alex is going to spend a few minutes going through the presentation of the actual R&D report itself from the ATO and Kashcade's perspective on that. We're then going to have a panel discussion around the R&D tax incentive and where we see the innovation landscape in conjunction with that, sort of as the future approaches us. And then we'll leave some time, like I said, for Q&A at the end. My apologies, my video is a little bit laggy and I have been having a couple of issues this morning. So hopefully we get through this in one piece, but just goes to show that there's still plenty of room for improvement on the technology front. So without further ado, I will hand over to Alex from Kashcade to present his findings.
Cool. Thanks, Samir. Like I introduced myself before, I'm Alex. I'm the co-founder of Kashcade, where basically we lend to companies to help them bring forward their future R&D refunds. So we're quite invested in the R&D tax incentive program. We work with VC-backed startups through to traditional businesses developing new technologies in their respective areas, through to ASX-listed biotechs and pharmaceutical companies. So we see it all. We gather a lot of data through our systems and conversations directly with customers, and we do research into the area more broadly. So we've done some research on a recent report by the ATO, and that's primarily what I'll be talking through today. But hopefully it lets you see what the average claimant looks like and what comparable companies to your own are doing with their claims. So as a bit of an overview, all this research comes from the transparency report that the ATO published back in October this year, so a couple of months ago. It covered about 11,500 companies out of the roughly 12,000 claimants from FY22. And it showed the company name, company number, and the expenditure claims, every single company. The report was an attempt to shed light on what companies were claiming, both in order to encourage uptake of the program and correct use of the program, as well as compliance with the program. And it'll be shared each year going forward now, so it's an inaugural thing. At a high level, though, the biggest cohort of claimants were small businesses, so those with less than 10 million in annual revenue. There was about $11.2 billion in expenditure claimed under this program. So that's $11.2 billion invested by Aussie companies, mostly for activities conducted in Australia in pursuit of developing new novel technologies and discovering new techniques to accomplish things. So that's pretty crazy in itself. And I think it's pretty exciting. So as you know, the program, the R&D tax incentive program itself is the lifeblood of a lot of innovative companies in Australia. And therefore, the backbone of a lot of what we've got to put on the global stage. So we do expect it to grow. It has been growing, but with any sort of growth of any incentive comes change, scrutiny, and definitely doubling down on compliance. So if we just take a look at the kind of history of the benefits of the program, the program itself, by way of an R&D tax offset, has been around for decades. But the R&D tax incentive program itself has been around since about 2011 in its current form, one way or another. It's seen really strong growth, particularly since 2019, with in FY22, what the report's based on, about $3.2 billion in tax benefits were paid out. So most of those benefits were refundable in cash. So that's going to companies with less than 20 million in revenue and recent losses. It also provided about 500 million in tax breaks to more established and profitable businesses. So the program administrators, they're budgeting another 6% increase by FY23. Based on what we see and hear from our customers and what we see happening in kind of investment markets, we think there's going to be a plateau for FY24, but then in FY25 and beyond, we think we'll see even greater growth off the back of return on equity investments and therefore wider capital available to continue investing in more R&D in Australia. There are a number of really cool stats that we pulled out of the analysis, and this is actually my favorite. It's about survival rates of companies. So we looked at every single company that existed in Australia in 2022, and then those that existed in 2024. And what we found was the average Australian company, 14.6% of Australian companies failed between 2022 and 2024, but only 1.2% of R&D tax incentive program users did. That's huge. That's like a 12x reduction in failure rates. So you can kind of deduce various causes behind this, but we think there's a good reason to believe that the R&D program is both a critical cash injection for many of these companies, and it's more attractive to investors as it's value accretive. It strengthens competitive positions when you're investing in R&D, and it sees every invested dollar go much further. So either way, one takeaway I'd really highlight is that it's really worthwhile making sure your prospective equity investors know about your eligibility, and your other financial providers like lenders too. It's seen as something that's quite favorable and makes your company seem lower risk and may really help your business look more attractive than it otherwise would. I was talking with a life sciences fund manager the other day, actually, and he was saying that he'll actually put more money into R&D tax incentive eligible companies because he knows those dollars will go about 40% further. So they get much more bang for their buck. It's reduced risk, and it's therefore really worthwhile establishing your credibility and your eligibility on the program and making them aware of it. We looked at the type of companies claiming. So the program split is largely skewed towards companies less than 10 years old. However, it does carry through at all stages. So I think personally this is great because it shows the program is supporting mostly early stage ventures working through the hardest stage of their life. And about $2 billion in cash went back to those companies. So I think that personally as a taxpayer, other taxpayers can be pretty comfortable seeing that result. The two things I'd take from here though are if you are in your first 10 years of business, you're the normal claimant. Even up to 18 years old, you're still in that majority bracket. And still there are plenty of well-established businesses 30, 40 years old who are still claiming. So the bottom line is that the program is there to support innovation. So if you're developing new technologies, no matter what stage of life your business is in, you're probably still eligible. So speak to your R&D advisor, no matter what point of the journey you're in. If we take a look at the geographic split, the average company claimed 350,000 in R&D expenditure. So for those that are interested, that's median, not mean. And it was pretty even across states. I think it's great to see a nice spread across Australia. That means the whole Australia is investing in innovation. Also on a postcode level, what's not shown here is that we did see concentration in the major cities, which is natural, of course. But importantly, we did see claimants coming from all areas far and wide. Like the most rural town would still have companies that are investing in innovation and claiming here. So again, the program does not have a bias against rural or remote innovators. Innovation and investment can and is happening anywhere. You're not going to stick out, and you're definitely not going to be judged differently if you're a rural claimant. When we take a look at median expenditures across industries, we did see that there was a spread of median expenditure across different industries. So those technologies in the highly complicated, regulated, and setup cost-heavy spaces did have the highest expenditure claims on average. So that's biotech, medtech, fintech, mining, defense, and aerospace. They were all above 500K. And then as you move to kind of business enterprise software, your classic SaaS type model, which most software companies are categorized as, the average claim was the median of 350,000. And then if you look to the smaller end of town, that really came from food and beverage companies, consumer goods, and lighter touch software like social media. But it's really interesting taking a look at this, putting yourself in a bucket and thinking about, what are you claiming versus the average claimant in your industry. And we can take the same kind of approach when we look at expenditure per resource. So we pulled the number of people from LinkedIn per company, and we did see a similar trend to the industry split. So those with the highest expenditure per resource were in biotech and medtech. They were claiming about 75 grand per employee though. So that's kind of most of the average salary you'll get there. To be honest, I thought it would be a bit higher. But again, we are talking FY22 numbers here. Blockchain, robotics, and IoT, defense, fossil fuels, they're also up there. But again, if we move to kind of enterprise software, we saw only about 25 grand per employee claimed. I will say though that number in particular may be skewed slightly because we do have a lot of more established businesses in the kind of enterprise software space. So only a small proportion of the overall workforce is working on R&D naturally. But it is, again, interesting to see and note and drive what you think. And then, again, down the bottom end of the claimant sizes, we naturally did see much less in those industries that had low average claim sizes on the previous slide. So they're kind of the key things we saw from the report, the key insights. But when we think about 2025 and beyond, it does leave us kind of reading between the lines of what's to come in future years. In sum, really, we do expect to see continued growth, but that will come with further compliance, naturally. So it's important to be really well documented and have solid R&D advisors who know what they're doing, knows your business, and can support with a solid and clear claim that realistically minimizes your risk of any sort of lengthy review. Interestingly, as R&D is becoming more of a topic of conversation for Australia and thinking about how we compete on a global stage, the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science, they're the body that kind of oversees the body that administers the R&D tax incentive program. They announced just a week ago, actually, that the R&D investment system at large, not just this program, is going to be reviewed in the next year, led by a group of accomplished technologists, including the Australian chair of Tesla, who's also part of the leadership team at the Tech Council of Australia. So I personally think we can expect to see quite a pragmatic approach to this, and there's generally positive sentiment. A lot of the wording is around how can we make sure that our R&D investment strategy is making sure that we can compete globally. So I wouldn't expect necessarily any major program changes to the R&D tax incentive, but I wouldn't be surprised if additional approaches are introduced to make sure that program compliance is maintained. So that's primarily what we saw in the report, what we think off the back of it. It's probably a good segue into our panel discussion. So I know Samir and Bailey at the InCorp team, you guys have the ear of Australia's industry. Samir, do you have any insights or expectations you can share of the program's future overall?
Yeah. Absolutely. I think one thing that's particularly interesting in terms of what you said around this review over the next 12 months, Alex, is that Oz Industry and the tax office are continually looking for ways to collaborate with the private sector in this space. So we've sat on a state reference group, which is sort of co-managed by DISA and the tax office, and we meet with them sort of on a quarterly basis. We get an opportunity to sort of raise questions, concerns, any recommendations or things that we're seeing in industry around the incentive itself. But the main thing that you touched on, and that I'd just like to reiterate for not just everyone on the call, but just the public at large claiming the R&D tax incentive, is just it's really important to have your systems and processes in place from day one as much as possible to ensure that you're capturing the right information, that you're maintaining the right level of documentation. It's really, really difficult, near impossible, to go back and do that retrospectively. So when it comes to the technical side of things, making sure that you have that in place, as well as on the financial piece, really just makes the claim process a lot smoother. And we should always approach every R&D tax incentive claim with the view that it will get some level of review at some point. So I think more and more we're seeing that the claimants that don't have that level of documentation or that level of rigor are slowly dropping out of the system, is certainly from our perspective. And the ones that are willing to sort of invest in those processes have a lot more longevity sort of towards them. Sort of following on from that, Bailey, would you have anything to add in that respect?
Yeah, I think it's important to note we're at an event earlier this year with the Shadow Minister for Science, and even he emphasised the importance of the R&D tax incentive and really highlighted how it has endured for so long. And we've been through many cycles of governments and no one's really targeted it too much. There was a little bit of discussion a few years ago, but it's really just endured. And I think that really comes down to how helpful and useful it is for the Australian economy and to encourage innovation and growth to occur here in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. Alex, one of the things that came up during your presentation, and look, there's a lot of information there to sort of absorb, and so I might politely ask you to share these slides or share a little bit more detail on this just with all the participants and registrants here later, as they might have some follow-up questions. But just over to you, Luke. One of the things that came up in Alex's piece was that professional, scientific, and technical services. So that's obviously a very broad spectrum. Led sort of R&D spending from the report from FY22, noting that it has been a couple of years since then. Are there any sort of emerging sectors that you see that are significantly increasing their R&D investments from what you see in the venture space? And is there anything from a VC standpoint that you think would be important to identify there?
Yeah, thanks, Samir. I think it's interesting to see those numbers from 2022. It'd be interesting to see how that trends over time, because I think it's probably less about professional scientific services will continue to, and biomeditech, I think, will get the lion's share. But what you're probably seeing over the last couple of years is just the scrutiny that's been on software and software businesses. And historically, Australia often gets prescribed as the country that only invests in B2B software and SaaS companies. And that's where I think the lion's share of VC funding is going. But what we're seeing now is probably a lot more scrutiny on those types of companies. I think previously in the past, and there's a lot of software development was getting done, and it was questionable whether it was actually research and development that was taking place. And I think that's where a lot of scrutiny is taking place. And some of those things you're talking about, Samir, of those types of companies that aren't keeping that documentation are probably getting found out from that. Because I know from my personal experience, I'd sit down at the end of the year with our CTO and say, well, how much do we spend on R&D? And he'd go back and try to calculate, and the number would be drastically lower than the amount of money I'd spend on software development. But it's just because we weren't keeping track of that expenditure throughout the year. So I'd say you're probably going to see similar areas here of those numbers staying, but I'd be interested to see how that software number, whether that reduces. And I think it just puts more of the onus on the teams that are in that space to spend more time planning, because they have to justify it far more detailed than they did previously.
Yeah, and I think actually there's an interesting correlation between what VCs are looking for and what the program is looking for. One thing that comes up a lot at the moment is we see everyone claiming for AI. Right? It's obviously a topic of hype at the moment, but it's not necessarily to say that because you're investing in AI, then it's something new and novel. What we're seeing quite quickly is a lot of artificial intelligence technologies and processes and techniques are actually becoming quite ubiquitous. And so there's actually less novelty out there to be able to do that. And so when VCs are looking to make an investment, they look at AI company number 1 versus AI company number 2, 3, 4, and 5 that they've seen working in a comparable space. And they really want to understand what's different about you. What are you doing to create new value, untapped value, something that's competitively and strategically different? And the same logic applies in R&D. The question is, what new knowledge are you generating? What are you doing here that's novel? Why doesn't this area that you're investing in exist today? And so that's quite interesting, but it really just comes down to the spirit of the program. It's really trying to support creating new things out of Australia and making those investments within Australia as well to try and achieve that.
Yeah, and I think particularly when it comes to the software space, right? The integrity of the R&D tax incentive means that as both advisors in our respect and the actual claimants themselves really need to have a very clear differentiation between what is considered software development and what is considered software R&D. This is often a question and an issue that we have with new clients that come through the door, where they feel that every dollar that they've spent from a software standpoint is eligible for the incentive, and that's simply not the case, right? It's really important to be able to show that this is the specific activity that we have a strong hypothesis for, that we've had to go through that experimental process in order to solve, and we have the documentation to support that. Then taking that a step further, that documentation not only has to support the work that's being done, but also draw a parallel between the expenditure side of things. So you can clearly kind of close the loop on how that all sort of comes together. So yeah, the more we get involved early, the easier it is for us to sort of create a more defensible claim for our clients in those sorts of scenarios. But I think what Alex and Luke, you both said was quite interesting in terms of it's obviously very impactful for early stage companies, right? The R&D tax incentive, it stretches their dollar or the VC's dollar a lot further if it can be done well. Luke, how does when you guys look at a company, do you guys actually do any kind of due diligence around the prior R&D claims that they've done? Sort of what are some, from an investment strategy standpoint and KC Ventures' interest in sort of the space? How does the R&D tax incentive sort of draw a parallel between VCs and the incentive?
No, it's an interesting point to me, and I think it's something that's been completely overlooked in the VC and the investment space for a long time. I was talking to one of the big 4 consulting firms, and they said that of their R&D work, a big percentage of that, like more than 20%, was actually assessing companies who are going through an acquisition process from the side of the acquirer to see whether there was any historical issues with their R&D claims, i.e. were they going and claiming things and overcooking the books in the past, which could then come back to bite them in the long run. And then often that was getting used against those companies through the acquisition process, because that's a risk that the acquirer is then taking on. So I think that is just something you got to keep in mind. Like, these things stay around for, up to 7 years, where those things you can go back. So just in the early days, it might seem like, hey, we can try and claim as much as possible and stretch the envelope a little bit more, and not particularly listening to the advice of advisors and others. But that can be something in the long run that can come back to bite you, because when investors are starting to look much more closely at these returns, that will be one of the DD processes that I think is going to get a bit more scrutiny, particularly if there's going to be a bit more scrutiny from the ATO.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely been a recommendation that we've been making true, and it's been a good way to tell our clients to maintain good documentation to help them through that process, because it's been something where we've seen the dual purpose of having good documentation in terms of your R&D tax incentive claim has the dual purpose of being quite supportive during an actual due diligence. So a lot of the information that a potential acquirer may want to see is something that we recommend maintaining. So around the veracity of the actual R&D process that you're undertaking, what you've maintained in that respect, what results you've seen, what's worked, what hasn't worked. All those sorts of things are actually very, very interesting to an acquirer. And so if you have sort of a pretty strong data room that includes some of that information, that's been a way where we've been able to convince a few clients that, look, it's really worthwhile to put the time in to increase the quality of your documentation, because later on it's going to have another purpose as well.
No, agreed, Sven. And maybe you'll be much more versed on this as well, but I think often I see founders have a bit of a misunderstanding as to what approval from Oz Industry in your tax return actually means. I think they mean that means it's been reviewed, it's been ticked off, and that's now all fine. Whereas this is a self-assessment claim that isn't necessarily going through that full rigorous review process. So just because you got the return, you got the cash in your bank, doesn't mean it's necessarily gone through an audit and can't be reclaimed down the track if it wasn't done accurately.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Luke. Thanks for that, Alex. I might just take a slightly different direction. Just another thing that came off the report is that nearly half of all claimants are considered small businesses. And so a question for you, Bailey, is what do you feel like are some of the biggest challenges that these businesses face in both, in accessing the R&D tax incentive, ensuring that they're getting what they're entitled to, and more importantly, defending it?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges is just being aware of the R&D tax incentive as well as the requirements. And that's as soon as you start conducting your R&D activities. So there's still a lot of limited awareness in terms of what initiatives exist out there to support early stage investors or early stage startups, particularly where it might be a startup founder who's starting their very first business for the first time, or someone from a technical background who's got an idea and needs to start a business to be able to continue their development and commercialize their product. It's not something where the government really proactively advertises to people. And in that case, some people don't even realize they're eligible for the incentive when they start their R&D. So they're not keeping documentation from the get-go. And it might mean that, come the end of the year, you're looking at, well, I've documented half of my projects. You're really reducing or halving the potential costs that you could claim and the potential benefit that you could receive. So really working with an R&D advisor as early as possible is critical. We can help you get the record keeping processes set up, all that documentation ready, and it will make both the R&D claim and any potential compliance activity, so a review from the regulator, it'll make that whole process so much easier, and will also just reduce the risk that you don't meet the R&D requirements, or that you have to give back part of your benefit some way down the line.
Yeah, and I mean, I think thanks for that, Bailey. I mean, I think one thing that we've obviously seen from our perspective is that there are unfortunately false actors out there that operate within the R&D tax incentive, and we've seen sort of people come through the door that are quite obviously looking to do the wrong thing, and it's pretty easy to tell those people where to go, right? But it is a bit concerning that they are out there. And typically what they won't be doing is keeping that quality of documentation. So I think, we're very much in support of the regulator's view around what constitutes quality documentation, both from a technical and financial standpoint. The incentive has been around in one format or another for over 20 years, right? Before it was the incentive or when it was the concession. So going back quite a long time. But I think the importance around maintaining the integrity of it is something that's absolutely consistent. So yeah, I totally agree. Alex, so the 88% of R&D claims as per that FY22 report are cash refundable, and so how do you see that being important from a kind of a policy standpoint, right? I mean, I think if I look back to the early days of InCorp advisory going on almost 15 years. Back then, a very significant percentage from our discussions with the tax office was claimants like CBA, BHP, like the much larger end of town. And our impression back then was they were pushing things much more towards more growth and emerging from a compliance standpoint. So yeah, what do you see as sort of the relationship between where R&D expenditure is being made from a policy perspective?
Yeah, I think it's important to include everyone. Because we do see fantastic innovations come from the whole spectrum. From companies like Cochlear, it's incredibly well known worldwide. Atlassian came through as the biggest claimant under the program, and there is a bit of controversy around, should they be claiming, tax credits under this program as such a, big behemoth. But I personally think yes. I think they are continually developing technologies and tools for everyone to become more productive across the globe. And again, it's really reinforcing that yes, fantastic things can come out of Australia, and Australia is investable. I think that's one thing we lack across the globe. We're so far removed from major markets and the rest of the world, despite us coming through with some really kind of pointed innovations. We've come up with some amazing things over the years, and some incredibly lucrative things over those years too. So for us to be able to continue to do this, I do think it's necessary across the spectrum, both refundable, non-refundable, early stage, late stage, non-profitable and profitable companies. And importantly as well, I think we just need to remember that the vast majority of the expenditure that is being claimed occurs within Australia. It's for Australian occurring activities. And so the amount of employment that this actually brings and circulates capital throughout the economy is fantastic. And off the back of it, it's not just employment, but it's really high value employment, because the learning curve that you go through when you're working on R&D and investing in a new technology and trying to build things and iterate quickly and do it efficiently and produce something, take it to market, scale it, it's incredible. And if we can have that kind of culture and that kind of learning circle perpetuates throughout the rest of the country, we're going to be in a fantastic position. We've been really lucky based on our commodities and the resources that we've had available, but we've been pretty lazy. And so the innovations that have gotten out there are few and far between, but they are really impactful. And what we see across the 100 or so companies we work with each year is there are these incredible innovations that these people are working on. Obviously not all of it's going to work, and that's why the cost-cutting incentive is there to try and incentivize them to take that risk on behalf of Australia, basically. Take those dollars, invest it in something that may or may not produce some sort of new technology, new technique. And so I think it's really important to include, and I think it does circulate and create a net positive outcome for everyone, importantly.
I mean, you mentioned Atlassian, right? I mean, they're obviously one of the largest employers of software engineers, sort of in Australia, and the R&D tax incentive has given them a significant kind of incentive, for lack of a better word, to do that, right? So who's to say that if something like it wasn't around, would they continue to hire in Australia? Would they look to other jurisdictions, which obviously not going to be eligible, but from an incentivization standpoint, it does encourage, I think, a lot of firepower to stay here locally. So I totally agree.
Exactly. And I wonder how many founders come out of those companies as well, right? They come from amazing teams within there. They get the skills, the trainings, and then they come out and have a crack at their own thing. If you look at some of Australia's kind of headline stories, you look at the founders, their backgrounds. They often had training in other organizations like this. And so I think that'd be much harder to come by if this program wasn't around.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned obviously being a founder. Luke, having founded a business previously and having claimed the R&D tax incentive in that business previously, is there anything that you can sort of share with the group around things that you wish you'd known at the time, having gone through that process?
Yeah, I think when I was a founder, I did it terribly, to be frank. We never really thought about it throughout the year. And what would typically end up happening almost every single year is that everyone would be too busy to focus the attention on it. We get to the end of the year and say, okay, great, here's your expenditure. Let's go and claim it. But the development team never spent enough time, and the technical team never spent enough time documenting. And what ended up happening is that we just never got anywhere near what I feel like we could have maximized from our returns. So I'd say the one lesson for me, and this is the work that we do with a lot of clients now, is we need to really drive that process throughout the year. And I think what we'll find, and most people probably agree with me on the call, is that the technical teams and the software developers, as an example, they're never going to be the people who are going to be driving this outcome. They love building things, and that's what they're good at. The financial teams, the founders themselves, they're the individuals who are going to be most incentivized to do this. So you're the ones, if they're the people that are on this call now, that need to sort of drive this outcome. And my recommendation is that the more you do that ongoing, i.e. monthly, let's figure out what our expenditure was, let's get all the documentation monthly, keep track of that throughout the year, the better it's going to be. I think that was probably the one lesson that I had. And then the second thing I'd say, and this comes to the point you were just talking about before, Alex, around Australian companies and how they've been able to grow, is it gets to the point where R&D incentives can actually completely change how you structure your business as you're growing globally. And where we got to with me was that we would keep all of our developers based here in Australia because there was such a big incentive to do so. And even though we're scaling and had probably more people over in Canada and the US and the UK, we still kept the core development team based out of Australia almost simply because of the R&D return. So make sure you're thinking about that. I know there's a lot of push towards offshoring, particularly around software development, but obviously that's not R&D claimable work. So you sort of need to, yes, there may be some cost implications of that, but you need to think through, is it actually worth in the long run when you're losing out on these incentives if you're doing true R&D work?
Yeah, thanks, Luke. I mean, that sort of does lead me to what I think will make this sort of our final piece before we open it up for questions. And I can see that a couple have been posted. Alex, I mean, if I think about the last kind of couple of years, and if I look at biotech, say for example, specifically, valuations have been kind of decimated in the small to medium cap sort of area, right? I mean, even if you look at the S&P, there's 10 companies holding that up, and in the mid cap space, it's been pretty brutal, right? So. I think what I'd like to understand from you is with the sort of thing that Kashcade does and the way you guys support that sort of debt versus equity kind of balance. You've got companies that are raising at significantly depleted valuations. How do you guys sort of come into the fray to help companies in that position?
Yeah, so I think our biggest use case is just extending runway to ahead of the next capital raise or throughout that process. So companies come to us, particularly around this time of year, and they go, look, we're going to start a capital raise process in February once, the whole investor base gets back from their breaks. And so we kind of need some runway until March, April. We've got this great refund built up, but we can't access it till probably the second half of the calendar year, maybe not even till, November, December next year. And so can we bring that forward and use that now to keep things going? And importantly, those companies that are revenue generating or that are working on a new product release or something like that, they're these really important milestones that absolutely do affect your valuation. And so they go, look, we need just 1 more month or 2 more months or 3 more months to get us to this next milestone, which is going to totally change our valuation. And so if you think about the cost of capital, the cheapest cost of capital is profit. You use your free cash flow, reinvest that, and you continue building your business. The next cheapest is debt. You pay whatever percentage of the loan over time, and then off you go. The most expensive is selling equity in your business because it's infinitely costly and you never get it back. And so when in 2021, when kind of VC money was flying everywhere and no one really cared about valuations, it was essentially kind of free money. That doesn't exist anymore. It was a total bubble. It was in a massive correction to 10, 15 years ago where things were. And a lot of VCs we speak to are saying that's where they expect things to stay. Maybe slight improvements as we're starting to see kind of later in this year. So the tax offset under the R&D tax incentive is hugely important to these companies. They do get most of the time roughly 43.5% of what they get, what they've invested in those R&D activities. And so being able to access that early is obviously what we do, has become a really appealing solution and important in maintaining shareholder ownership.
That leads quite well into one of the questions that we have here on the chat, which is, and I might send this one to you, Bailey, and it's a little bit loaded. It's what are you guys roughly seeing as the turnaround times from an application being processed and a refund hitting the bank account? I think if I might just to set you up a little bit there, we used to be a little bit more certain, but with the 300-400 claims that we do at InCorp every year, what are you sort of seeing in that respect?
Yeah, I think the truthful answer is that it really depends. So often for a one project, simple R&D claim, you're usually looking at maybe 2 to 3 weeks from the Department of Industry side of things. And then once the tax return is lodged, the ATO is pretty consistent, sort of 20 to 28 days. If your application's a little bit more complex or lengthy, you're probably going to be waiting maybe a month or a little bit longer for the Department of Industry to be processing that application. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem with it or that there's concerns raised. It probably just has to do with the length length of it or the complexity of it, and they do take a little bit more time. With the number of R&D claimants increasing, they also are quite limited in terms of capacity. So there's more applications going in, more time needs to be taken to process them. And so it just takes longer to get the approval back from the government. But I think it all ties back into Luke's point before about being proactive with your documentation throughout the year. If you have everything ready come July 1, then you can lodge your claim right away and you can get approval rather quickly and then get the money in potentially July, August, versus if you're not proactive at all, you've left it to the last minute and you're going to spend 10 months trying to put together your documentation, collate everything. You're not going to get your refund for potentially, June the next year. So you're talking almost a 12-month difference in terms of when that cash is going to be received. So I think really just be as ready as possible come July 1. So be proactive with your documentation, have it all ready to go, and then speak to your advisor ahead of time so that you can ensure that you minimize any potential processing delays along the way.
Yeah, and I think on top of that as well, Bailey, there's also the aspect of contemporaneous evidence. And so if you're looking at this, every quarter or, so throughout the year, actually throughout the year, you're conducting those activities and you're doing a bit of a check, you're putting your timesheet, you're going through that process with your advisor to make sure everything's, in good order, then that actually significantly reduces the risk of some sort of lengthy review. You might get a quick question from the industry or for the ATO about your claim. And if you can just straight away go, yep, here's our folder, bang, we've been doing it throughout the year. What we've seen anecdotally is that they're a very quick turnaround. Oh, yeah, thanks for that. All sorted. We understand it. 1 week later, it's paid out and done. So that's massively helpful there too.
Perfect. Thank you. Another question that we had here was from Arnaud Garin as one of the participants, saying that he's surprised with the medium spend of 350K, and do we have any detail around the average ratio of expenses eligible for R&D versus total expenditure in a company? Alex, I might send that one to you.
Yeah, so unfortunately in the report we didn't see total expenditure versus claimed expenditure. The average 350,000 is the median. We did see up to 200 million in the case of Atlassian, and then the smallest eligible under the program is a threshold of 20 grand. And so there is pretty widespread. But if you think about it, if the average company, particularly in these early stages, like a lot of them are, raises about $1 million, they might spend that over kind of 2 years. And then if a good chunk of that, 2/3, 75% of that $500,000 per year spend is in that early stage working on R&D, then that's kind of where we get to that 350 figure. So it wasn't hugely surprising on our end. But again, I think it really depends on the industry. So, like we were looking at before, those sectors and industries, you do see a drastic difference across the industries. But yes, I personally would like to see more of that data. Kashcade, we do actually gather a lot of data when we assess companies. We look at their claimed expenditure versus their total operational capital expenditure and cost of goods as well. And we do see percentages vary based on the stage of company, basically, and the type of company. So it is a real mix. Naturally, you'll see the more mature companies claiming less of their overall expenditure on R&D, and the earlier stage companies working on crazy niche unknown spaces claim a higher percentage, up to 100% of what they're doing there. So you do see a spread. But yeah, I'd love to see that data across the full 11,500 too.
Yeah, fantastic. Guys, thank you. Really appreciate all of your time today. Really appreciate everyone that's logged on today to have a bit of a listen and get some education on where things are at around both the ATO R&D report and the incentive as a whole. We will be distributing a recording of this around, as well as the slides and so on, and everyone's contact details. But Luke, Bailey, Alex, thank you guys all very much again for your time. We will be looking to do more of these as time goes on, as well as some in-person events at our offices here in Sydney. So please reach out if you do have any follow-up questions to this. And in the meantime, I hope everyone has a very, very wonderful and safe holiday break, and look forward to many more years of claiming the R&D tax incentive. Thank you very much.
Cheers, guys.
See you, everyone. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.